Hello, everybody. Just making sure I've unmuted myself. Welcome to the Blake Society event for September. My name's John. I'm one of the trustees of the Blake Society. Just before we get started on the event itself, just wanted to do the quick spiel for the Blake Society for people who aren't already members. So we put on monthly events where we discuss aspects of Blake's work and his life, or talk about Blakean topics. And we try to make them as open as possible and invite everyone. But if you enjoy this evening and you're not already a member and want to investigate joining the Blake Society, then please head to blakesociety.org and you can find out more about us and sign up. And your contribution will go towards putting on more events like this. Next month, on Wednesday, the 19th of October, we have a talk in which the children's author SF Saeed is going to talk to Tamsin Rosewell about his new novel, Tiger, which is spelt in the Blakean way with a Y. By the way, please feel free to switch on your cameras if you'd like this evening, as long as you can keep yourselves muted until we get to the Q&A later. That would be great. Thanks. So this evening, we're thrilled to be joined by Daisy Hay, who is the author of this fascinating and handsome tome, A Dinner with Joseph Johnson. So in a moment, I'm going to hand over to Daisy herself for our the starter of our evening's meal, and she's going to tell us some more about the book. But just, I suppose, for an aperitif would be to continue the conceit. I'm just going to give an introduction to Daisy and her book. So Daisy Hay is Associate Professor in English Literature and Life Writing at the University of Exeter. Her previous books include Young Romantics, The Shelleys, Byron and Other Tangled Lives, and Mr. and Mrs. Disraeli, A Strange Romance. This feast of a book, Dinner with Joseph Johnson, was published earlier this year, and it describes the lives and work of the writers, artists and thinkers who gathered at the weekly dinners hosted by Joseph Johnson at his home and place of work in 72 St. Paul's Churchyard. There's a blurb on the back of the book by Jonathan Bate, which describes Daisy's book as truly a biography of the spirit of the age. And I think that's a very apt description. And with our sort of Blake obsessive antennae twitching, I think it's a very evocative description of the kind of professional and cultural world in which Blake moved as an engraver, but perhaps for various reasons didn't quite fit into that world in the same way as everyone else. So with that set up, I'm going to hand over to Daisy for our starter. Thanks. Daisy, I think you're still muted.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm really sorry, everyone. I've had a problem with my AirPods since we did the tech check earlier. So I've had to switch microphones. This is untested. Is this all right? Can someone nod?
Sounds good to me.
Great. Thanks very much. Okay. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to talk this evening. It's lovely to be among Blakeans, and thank you to John in particular for assembling such excellent company for the evening. So I'll start with a bit of context. My new book, Dinner with Joseph Johnson, is part group biography, part cultural history of the generation of writers and artists and musicians and theologians and doctors and scientists and natural philosophers who found their voice through the publisher Joseph Johnson and who met in shifting constellations at his house between the years 1760 and 1809. So what I'm going to do this evening is read some short passages from the book to sketch in its shape, to talk about how Blake kind of fitted into this circle and the ways in which he didn't, and to think about the place where they all met, Johnson's house in the city of London, 72 St. Paul's Churchyard. So I'm going to start just with a short passage from the book, which comes from the introduction, which brings its cast together in one place. And I'm going to attempt to share my screen so I can show you a slide, which will show you my slightly panicked chat with Ian about the tech. Okay, does that work? Everyone good? Great. So when I'm reading, what I'm going to do is show you a picture of The Nightmare by Henry Fuseli, because a version of this painting hung in Johnson's dining room at St Paul's Churchyard. So let us imagine for a moment that the men and women who dined with Joseph Johnson are gathered around the table once again, according to their centrality to Johnson's story rather than the realities of time and place. Gradually, a picture of the community he created becomes visible beneath this painting of The Nightmare. Seated on Johnson's right hand, monopolising the attention of his host, is the artist responsible for this image of incubus and sleeper, Henry Fuseli. Fuseli himself acknowledges that once he starts drinking, he finds it hard to control his tongue. A few glasses of wine cause his spirits to run away with him, and he always repents of his extravagance in conversation, reports one witness to his table manners. Fuseli's chief sparring partner at dinner is a mathematician called John Bonnycastle. During working hours, Bonnycastle teaches maths to trainee soldiers at the Woolwich Military Academy. During leisure, he writes books which might be familiar to some of the Blakeians here tonight, because Blake was one of his early illustrators, designed to reveal the beauties of mathematics to general readers. Bonnycastle is not an elegant eater. According to the testimony of one young guest, he has an unfortunate tendency to goggle over his plate like a horse. When he laughs, his teeth are exposed at the sides, and in Fuseli's presence, he laughs and shouts in equal measure. Sitting apart from the squabbles of Fuseli and Bonnycastle in this imagined gathering is Joseph Priestley. Priestley is at once a philosopher, chemist, theologian, teacher, and more. There's barely an aspect of human existence to which Priestley hasn't given some thought. At his own table, Priestley has to be dissuaded from reading while he eats. But at Johnson's house, there's too much pleasure to be had in the company of others for Priestley to be distracted by books. Chief among his friends at the table are Benjamin Franklin, a fellow chemist increasingly distracted by the deterioration in relations between Britain and his native America, and the Unitarian minister Theophilus Lindsay, whose chapel at Essex Street, further down the Strand, is another gathering place for many of Johnson's friends. Also clustered around Priestley are Richard Lovell Edgeworth and his brilliant novelist daughter Maria, Erasmus Darwin, a doctor and poet whose girth is barely contained by his waistcoat, and from the younger generation, the quiet figure of another doctor, John Aitken, and John's sister, the writer Anna Barbauld. Barbauld is usually accompanied on her visits to St Paul's Churchyard by her husband Rochemont, a Suffolk schoolmaster eclipsed by his brilliant wife. In letters to friends, Barbauld writes of the intensity of her pleasure in the conversation to be found at Johnson's, although sometimes, like Fuseli, she writes the morning after dinner with wine-sodden wisdom of the perils of a late night on a tender head. There are more men than there are women at dinner with Joseph Johnson, but Barbauld and Maria Edgeworth are by no means the only representatives in the dining room of their sex. Sometimes the company is joined by the white-capped figure of Sarah Trimmer, a children's writer and devout Anglican who has little in common with Johnson's more radical guests. Also present when the boundaries of time and place are collapsed is the poet Charlotte Smith, who finds refuge on Johnson's list in the final years of her life. His nieces, Elizabeth and Hester, form part of the family unit at St Paul's Churchyard, alongside their younger brother Roland, who will become first Johnson's apprentice and later one of his heirs. But when he joins the story, Roland is a pupil at Barbauld's school. But of all the women who gather for dinner, it is the voice of Mary Wollstonecraft that can be heard most clearly across the table. It's the early opinion of another dinner guest, the philosopher William Godwin, that Wollstonecraft has a good deal too much to say for herself, but even Godwin's attention is snagged by the clarity with which Wollstonecraft makes her views known. At this end of the table, Godwin would prefer to hear from Thomas Paine, whose political writings have caused a stir in both America and Britain. He's to be disappointed, since Paine, as Godwin will later acknowledge, is no great talker. Another guest is also disappointed in Paine, although for different reasons. An aspiring poet called James Hurdist, who seriously overestimates the extent of his own talent, finds Paine's appearance as objectionable as his views. In a letter to a friend, Hurdist complains that Paine's face is as red and somewhat resembling in the inequality of its surface the coat of a Seville orange. Payne's hair is as bad, thin, carelessly frizzed, according to Hurdis, and untidily held back with a slip of ribbon. Jostling for space at the table alongside the men and women who come to dinner most regularly are other figures eager to make their voices heard. Amongst a group of young men trying to carve space in the conversation is the poet William Wordsworth, down on his luck after being forced by political crisis to leave France. Alongside Wordsworth in this outer group is his friend Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Some of the older guests have nursed the hope that Coleridge might channel his genius with words as a minister in the Unitarian Church, but they are to be disappointed. Also anxious for a place at the table is another chemist, Humphrey Davy, who, the gossips report, sometimes runs to dinner straight from his workshop without stopping to change his shirt, and William Hazlitt, a follower of Godwin who's turned his back on the religion of Johnson and Priestley. Hazlitt wants to paint Johnson, but he cannot persuade the bookseller to sit still long enough to have his likeness taken. Johnson is more interested in listening to others than he is in his own image. As the candles flicker, illuminating both the animated faces around the table and the strange image on the wall, he remains still. When the wine glasses have been drained and the guests at this phantasm of the dinner disappear down the stairs and into the night, he's left alone in the crooked dining room. There are servants to clear the dirty crockery, their presence barely registered in the historical record. There's work to be set in train for the morning and manuscripts to be read. The business of making and selling books is unrelenting, and within a few hours, the candles guttering in the dining room, the shutters protecting the shop front will be thrown back, and into 72 St Paul's Churchyard will come once again the procession of authors, tradesmen and friends, for whom dinner with Joseph Johnson offers the prospect of sustenance, conversation and safety. So I hope that gives you an idea of the cast of Johnson's world and the people who came to dinner at St Paul's Churchyard. Two notable absences from that list. One is William Cooper, who was probably Johnson's most important author in terms of both financially, the amount of money he made Johnson, but also in terms of the creative relationship between them, which you can see in Cooper's letters. Johnson essentially acts as Cooper's editor. And the other is Blake himself, who really only quite rarely appears to have joined the company at dinner, and whose position, in a way that may not surprise you, as I hope I'll sketch out over the course of the next few minutes, was really that of a kind of respected fellow tradesman in Johnson's world, rather than as a kind of creative figure in his own right. And that seems to have had a kind of impact on how Blake occupied this space in the dining room. But I think as important to the story of Johnson and Blake and the work they did together and apart in 72 St Paul's Churchyard as the people was the building itself. So I'm now just going to take us on a brief tour of Johnson's house. Number 72 St Paul's Churchyard occupied a corner position on the other side of the road from the west door of the cathedral. If you know this bit of London, you'll know that this whole streetscape has gone. It was destroyed in a single night in the Blitz in 1940, when 5 million books went up in flames in one of the worst bombing raids to the east of London. And so Paternoster Row exists now, which is the heart of book selling in London, only as a kind of shadow road. It's still marked out by the kind of geography of Paternoster Square, but only just. The great dome of St Paul's towered above the surrounding buildings, a physical manifestation of the Anglican Church from which Johnson dissented. Number 72 is one of the biggest buildings on either the Row or the churchyard, but it was nevertheless dwarfed by the scale of St Paul's. Johnson's new house was 2 doors along from London House Yard. This is in 1770 when he moved there, where he took warehouse space, and it backed onto narrow Mitre Court, and the rear of the house is on the south side of Paternoster Row. Its footprint was asymmetric, narrow at the front and wide at the back. Writing in 1839, an elderly gentleman who visited Johnson in his youth recalled how old-fashioned the building appeared. St Paul's Churchyard had none of the Georgian homogeneity of newer London streets, so anyone walking eastwards to the old city would have felt themselves walking back in time. Descriptions survive of 2 of the spaces at number 72. One is the shop itself, narrow and dark, with books displayed in the window, with office space in the back, probably giving way to the warehouses and alleys of Mitre Court. The shop was a bookshop in the contemporary sense, in that it was open during trading hours to casual customers, with stock for sale on the shelves and in the window, much of it printed by Johnson, but also by his competitors. And those of you who know the letters of Richard Twist will know that Johnson allowed Blake to display copies of the illuminated books in his window to drum up custom before he went to work printing. But the shop was also the destination, not just for customers, but for those who visited Johnson on business. So suppliers or authors might start their conversations with him or with one of his assistants in the shop before being ushered upstairs, if their business demanded, to the dining room to continue discussion. And the other was the dining room, the room decorated with Fuseli's sketches. There are several accounts that put this painting of the Nightmare on the wall at number 72. What it probably was is not this exact version, but one of Fuseli's, if you look at the catalogue resume for Fuseli, there are 4 or 5 versions of the Nightmare. And it's probably one of those, not the version that was exhibited at the Royal Academy, but a preparatory sketch or a draft which Johnson had on his wall. Here in this dining room, Johnson conducted negotiations by day, and as the decades drew onwards, and as we've seen, increasingly brought his friends and his authors to dinner together for dinner by night. I was often surprised at the quiet comfort and ease with which he entertained the characters who assembled at his literary parties, commented one of his guests. The parties were held in a plain, moderate-sized room, where at other times important transactions took place and immense sums were paid to authors, artists, stationers, printers, and others concerned with him in the trade. And Blake's biographer, William Gilchrist, offers a further description of Johnson's dining room, very famous, a little quaintly shaped upstairs room with walls not at right angles. This odd-shaped dining room was at the heart of the house. It was a space where the public and private lives of the building and its occupants met, where Johnson was simultaneously at home and at work. Priestley took up residence for weeks at a time, making the dining room his office and receiving room during long winter visits to London. Friends congregated for food and for conversation. Paper sellers and printers haggled over prices at the table. Most of the time, Johnson's staff passed silently through the paper traces of the house and its inhabitants, although one guest recalled that one of the shopmen, a Mr. Redman, had originally trained as a schoolmaster and retained the cross habits and manners of a pedagogue. So that's the cast and the setting established. Let's turn to the story of Johnson and Blake. It's a long and complex story with several acts, and so I can only really give you a couple of kind of indicative episodes here. As you'll all know, Blake appeared in Johnson's circle in the early 1780s, primarily as an engraver, although an engraver who Johnson rapidly realised had a marked talent and a highly unusual eye. Blake was afforded from an early stage much more kind of creative facility in terms of how he interpreted the commissions he were given by Johnson than were some of Johnson's other engravers. Given Blake is the guest of honour at our feast tonight, I thought I'd give you a sense of how he appears in the book and in Johnson's story by reading a short section about the work Johnson commissioned for Blake on Wollstonecraft's translation of Christian Salzmann's Elements of Morality. The book came out and then Johnson commissioned a second edition with illustrations by Blake from 1791. And the reason I like this anecdote so much is because it gives us the memory of a child reader. So this is after that moment in which Johnson has allowed Blake to display early copies of the illuminated books in the window of the shop. The illuminated books did nothing to relieve Blake from the pressure to earn a living. Johnson understood this as intuitively as he understood Blake need to publish his work on his own terms. In 1791, he commissioned Blake to provide 44 plates for an enlarged edition of Wollstonecraft's translation of Salzmann's Elements of Morality. This was written for children, and like Wollstonecraft's own original stories, it followed Sarah Trimmer's example as it showed children the dangers of indolence and greed. Wollstonecraft drew attention to the similarity between Salzmann's work and her own in a prefatory advertisement. All the pictures are drawn from real life, she announced. That I heartily approve of this method, my having written a book on the same plan is the strongest proof. Wollstonecraft's translation and Salzmann's originals followed an apparently well-trodden path, along which children who mistreat animals learn the error of their ways, and those with money are instructed in the importance of paternalistic care for those without. This all predates Wollstonecraft's move into the work for which she was most famous. Salzmann's ideas interested Wollstonecraft, but it was evidently the necessity of paying for the roof that Johnson had put over her head, and that's a story we can talk about if you want to later, that made her take up the project in the first place. Blake's illustrations, however, transformed the second edition of Elements of Morality in an artifact altogether more striking. They offer child readers a rare thing, a sight of themselves not as stylized dolls, but as individuals who run and breathe and feel. There's one. Sorry, it's not a terrific image, but you probably know this. This is the child lost in a wood. What will become of me, cries this child. The wood is tunneled and dark. The child's fear is evident. When she was very elderly in 1883, Anna Barbauld's niece, Anna Le Breton, recalled the excitement of being given a book with pictures which captured so profoundly the experience of childhood. And she wrote, unlike the children of the present day, and of course she's writing in 1881, the kind of golden age of children's literature. Unlike the children of the present day, who expect a constant supply of little novels splendidly bound and illustrated by the best artists, our little books were clothed in the plainest paper covers with hardly ever an illustration, with indeed one exception, a translation by Mary Wollstonecraft of a German work, the text quaint and foreign, and full of wonderful pictures, which I long afterwards found out were by Blake. Blake, she continued, was only just beginning to be recognised as a great artist, but it was his genius, she thought, which accounted for the hold these designs kept upon my memory. The reviewer for Johnson's in-house magazine, The Analytical Review, shared Le Breton's view that the quality of Blake's images was unusual, especially in a volume designed for children. The prints are far superior, both with respect to design and engraving, to any we've ever seen in books designed for children. The Analytical's reviewer thought that the impact of Blake's work was all the more significant given the different ways in which children experience text and image. That prints judiciously introduced are particularly calculated to enforce a moral tale must be obvious to everyone who has any experience in education. I'll move away from this slide now because it's not a terrific image. But despite the creative success, as Johnson saw it, of enterprises such as this, Blake often found working for Johnson to be a frustrating and indeed a thankless business, particularly as his own sense of his craft and his art developed. And that frustration and the way in which Blake viewed Johnson is, I think, a really important part of their shared story, because it reveals so much of the complexities of their relationship. So I'll turn now to a later section from the book, which picks up the story after Blake's move to Sussex and into the orbit of William Hayley. William Cooper has died, and Johnson, as Cooper's publisher, is very involved in discussions about the form that Hayley's biography of Cooper should take. He wants it to be published in a uniform edition with reissued versions of The Task and of Cooper's other poetry. And there's a real spat emerges about paper quality and about the merits of printers in Chichester rather than in London, which Blake sees as a kind of closing ranks of the London booksellers against the kind of the artists and the tradesmen of the provinces and of Sussex, where he sort of invested so much energy at this point. Blake's association with Hayley and his connection with the life of Cooper prompted in him a tangle of emotions about Johnson, the man who had both given him a living and hemmed in his vision, he thought, through years of mechanical drudgery. His letters to Hayley reveal that he resented Johnson's hold on him, which he thought representative of the corrupt power wielded over men of imagination by a cabal of London booksellers. Johnson may be very honest and generous too, where his own interest is concerned, but I must say he leaves no stone unturned to serve that interest, he wrote in 1804. He'd received letters from Johnson over the years which called for the sceptre of Agamemnon rather than the tongue of Ulysses, but he viewed the publisher's failings as symptomatic of the city that had made him. In his description of London and Songs of Experience, Blake had written of the capital as the birthplace of sin in lines you'll all know by heart. I wander through its chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. Johnson, in Blake's view, was above all the product of those chartered streets that gave him power and marked his soul. In London, he told Hayley, every calumny and falsehood uttered against another of the same trade is thought fair play. Engravers, painters, statuaries, printers, poets, we are not in a field of battle, but in a city of assassinations. Ultimately, Johnson's commercial preeminence drove Blake away. In the support extended to Johnson by Richard Phillips and other booksellers in the city, Blake saw a world in which he had no security, closing ranks to protect one of its own. When Fuseli and the artist Joseph Farrington gossiped about the great names of the day, Blake the engraver, that famous phrase from Farrington's diary, didn't figure in their conversation, and of course neither did Blake the poet. Fuseli, wrote Farrington in 1803, thinks Cooper the best of all poets of the period, above Hayley, etc., etc., even Darwin. He had imagery and his style was more perfect and pure. And then Farrington continues, Fuseli considers Bonaparte a man buoyed up with pride and presumption and of unrestrained passion, and that he must suffer much in the opinion of the world by his conduct and deportment. This is in 1803. He thinks the war will be short. Proof, if anyone needed, that Fuseli was wrong about Blake and wrong about Bonaparte. But on that bit of soothsaying about the future, I will close so we can move to conversation and questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Daisy. That was wonderful. Lovely to have some extracts from the book itself, some morsels of the book itself in there. I love all the stuff about arguments about paper and that sort of thing. There's a few moments in the book where you get these little glimpses of the professional work of Johnson in that sense. There's a bit later on where him and Joseph Priestley are writing to each other across the Atlantic, which is actually quite sad because they're kind of the two quite old men at this stage who've known each other for most of their lives, kind of falling out towards the end. But there's similar sort of arguments about the paper stock that that Priestley is having his work printed on and then sent over to Britain. Sort of counterintuitively, I'm slightly resistant to the idea of talking too much about Blake, because as someone who's read lots of books about Blake over the past couple of years, one of the things I loved about your book was that it's that he is a peripheral character in it who only sort of takes center stage every now and again. And I did a thing actually where I was going to read a sort of cast list of all of the, well, not all, but many of the people, the names who kind of come through the book and through Johnson's dining room to give people who haven't read the book yet an idea of the kind of I suppose his place as a publisher in the second half of the 18th century. But I think your first extract did that brilliantly, so I won't sort of cover the same ground. But I thought one way to do this might be just to pick some of those names and to sort of start talking about them and see where we get to, because I think some of those writers and artists and thinkers have very direct links with Blake, where he may have illustrated their works, such as Wollstonecraft, or worked with them. And some, there are sort of more indirect links and nuances and correspondences. But I thought probably the obvious place to start with would be Joseph Johnson himself. And the first thing that surprised me was to discover that he wasn't a Londoner, that he came from Liverpool or thereabouts originally. So could you just tell us something about Johnson's background and his early life to start with?
Absolutely. He was born in Liverpool in 1738. He was born a Baptist and brought up in a Baptist family who lived, in fact, next to the old Baptist burying ground, next to the Baptist burying ground in Everton, outside Liverpool. And he was sent south to take up his apprenticeship, age 14, with a Baptist bookseller called George Keith when he was 14. And so that's his training. So in the 1760s, when he arrives in London, that is the world. He's kind of watching Baptist tracts, prophesying damnation, roll off the tracks at the printing presses as he begins to negotiate the kind of world of the city, with its rules governing the behaviours of apprentices, and it's kind of the society of corruption against vice are beginning to be active, but it's a lawless, difficult place. But once he's freed of his apprenticeship, he really makes a remarkable success of things quite quickly. He sets up in business himself, to begin with, on Fish Street Hill near the medical schools of Southwark. So lots of his earliest works are medical texts for students who walk past his shop. He's an early hit with John Newton's Authentic Narrative, which is the kind of Newton's first foray into the world of autobiography and conversion narrative. But it's also very much about Newton's activities as a slave trader. But it's an enormous success. And over the course of the 1760s, he also moves away from Baptism, the Baptist faith, to Unitarianism, probably through the influence of William Enfield and the Dissenting Chapel in Warrington, which Johnson clearly had lots of family connections with, probably through reading and talking to Priestley himself, who becomes very quickly an enormously important figure. But one of the things that was really striking to me was that I think when I read about Johnson in the past, he's always appears in the record as a kind of solitary figure, as a kind of, no family, a kind of the kind of figure who's left alone when everyone else leaves. But actually, he remains very tapped into a big network of Liverpool kin right the way through his life. So he has a sister who dies very early, and her husband remarries and has children. And those children include Roland Hunter, who he educates at Barbauld School, who becomes his heir. Roland's cousin John Miles, who also goes to learn the trade. The nieces who were kind of sent south from Liverpool to keep house, Miss Johnson, Elizabeth Johnson, and then Hester, who's a younger niece. And then Hester marries, and her husband Henry is one of the most frequent visitors at dinner. And you can see that in Godwin's diary, where they're unidentified, but that's who they are. And then even after Hester dies, Henry Newham still is coming to dinner. So there's this huge sort of network of family around him, but family partly connected by blood or by kind of proxy blood in the case of the Hunters, but also family as a constituency that you make. So, the friendship with Fuseli is so important and kind of so central and defies probably modern labels for it. So that was a big surprise, both the extent to which those connections with Liverpool remain strong and vibrant and influence decisions, for example, to publish John Newton, who's a Liverpool figure himself, but also that shape Johnson's life. So he and Fuseli go back to Liverpool each summer to visit family. When Wollstonecraft needs a servant, Johnson finds one from that kind of extended Liverpool network. So there's an awful lot of kind of connection. And he's not a particularly mobile figure. He doesn't travel the country, but he connects to different parts of the country in lots of interesting ways.
It's really interesting. I was going to talk about this. I was going to ask you to talk about this next, about the kind of the literal family, and if you like, the kind of literary family side of things. I think this is why the idea of using the dinners as a sort of binding narrative works so well, because it is a commercial enterprise, but it's also social and familial. There's one of my favorite Blake quotations is from the one of the proverbs of hell in the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, where it says the bird a nest, the spider a web, man friendship. And it made me think of Johnson himself almost as a sort of benevolent spider at the center of a web of all these authors and thinkers and artists across the country and further afield. The other thing I wanted to pick up on was we think of Johnson as a publisher of kind of radical authors, and of course he was, and Wollstonecraft and Priestley and all the sort of trouble they got into later when the French Revolution had happened and Pitt's government and everything. But also it was fascinating to see the kind of breadth of material that he published. And you mentioned the early link to kind of medical authors, but there's you mentioned at one point there's a Johnson's Complete Pocketbook, which appears to be a sort of proto-Filofax for businessmen. And then there's John Eliot's Medical Pocketbook, which is like a sort of pocketbook for traveling doctors to look up symptoms and treatments. And then there's sermons and cookery books. He's really sort of publishing everything, isn't he? It's amazing.
He is publishing. The range is astonishing. And actually, I found the medical publishing to be incredibly interesting and actually incredibly moving. Because although there is a kind of enormous diversity to the work Johnson publishes, you can kind of label a lot of it by the fact that it's all concerned with making life better in some way, for some people. And, to live in a body in the 18th century, it turns out to be enormously grueling, hard work. And so lots of Johnson's medical publishing is about kind of trying to disseminate knowledge and best practices, not always right, into the hands of country doctors so that you can kind of alleviate suffering, where possible. So, he publishes one of his most influential books is Edward Rigby's Essay on the Uterine Hemorrhage, which sounds very bland and it sounds very obscure, but it's the first book to describe placenta previa. Rigby is the first person to do that ever. And it gives a method for turning a baby in utero, a breech baby. And Rigby bases his work on having delivered hundreds of babies in the slums of Norwich. And what he describes as his method is, when you go into a room, Rigby says, the first thing you do is you let in fresh air, and then you speak to the patient and you calm her down and you ask for water. And it's just a kind of humanity. It's just kind of astonishing, actually. So it's about how Johnson's very concerned with how you disseminate that knowledge out into the country. John Aitken's work on building hospitals, where it's astonishing to read in 2020, but he says, build hospitals with windows which open top and bottom so that air can circulate. Build cubicles so that you don't have infection trapping. Get people out of their beds in the daytime so that germs can't travel on these wards. So it's astonishingly kind of prescient, some of it, although some of it's obviously balmy. But Johnson also, because he has a real eye, and I think this connects to the material around Blake, some of it's very beautiful. So he publishes an edition of John Hunter's work on teeth. And some of the engravings for this manual about dentistry are, kind of Blakean in their detail and their strangeness and their kind of Gothic, their kind of Gothic reimagining of the skull. So I'm interested in the kind of way in which you can make art too, out of things which might sound bland and boring. But yeah, I mean, I loved all the cookery stuff and all the kind of all that.
That thing of writing poetry about what we would think of as sciencey things or medical things, obviously, I mean, Erasmus Darwin probably being the most obvious example of that, which seems weird to us to write a long poetry about biology and plants. But
I think there are two things which are very difficult for us to get our head around. One is around that fact that science and literature is not a distinction which really holds up. The other is what you said at the beginning, which is that in this world, Blake and Wordsworth and Coleridge are sort of bit part players. The big celebs are Cooper and Priestley and Darwin. So we have to kind of revise our sense of who's up and who's down.
Yeah. Given that, could we move on to some of the other big players? Now, I've written on my notes here, we need to talk about Henry, in brackets, Fuseli, who in some respects just sounds like a dreadful person, just like completely obnoxious. But people are always either complaining about him or kind of singing his praises and saying what a brilliant wit he is. It seems like a really sort of Marmite kind of figure.
Enormously Marmite. I mean, there is Blake. There is a brilliant anecdote in the Blake records about Blake says Fuseli, he swears at him. Blake says, why do you? And he says, why do you swear at me so much? But leaves off swearing himself.
Yeah.
He's clearly a very divisive figure. Lots of people at dinner say that if he's there, you can't hear anyone else. He is the most important friend Johnson has. They meet in 1764. They live together for much of the 1760s. Fuseli writes in his letters to his great friend Johann Caspar Lavater about the joy that he is taking in making art and friends in London. It's completely destroyed by fire. Fuseli loses everything. But then he returns to London after travel in Europe. And although he marries and their lives continue separately, he is simply Johnson's most stalwart ally. And that goes both ways. They go on holiday together. And when Johnson is old and ill, it's Fuseli who walks 5 miles every morning from Johnson's house in Fulham, where he retires, to the Royal Academy before the dawn breaks, so that he can be in 2 places at once. So Fuseli is manifestly an impossible figure. But he is also someone who demonstrates great loyalty to Johnson. And they're kind of working out how to represent their relationship in a way which felt sort of honest but not anachronistic was a real challenge, actually.
Because at the other end of their life together, Fuseli is kind of the first person who motorbike departing, who Johnson kind of takes under his wing, and he kind of moves in with him at first, doesn't he? And again, you sort of talking about the way in which that kind of idea of a family that Johnson created for himself, he's kind of the first person that he does that with.
That's right. And that sense that, the kind of the bonds of kinship that you make yourself are as important as the bands of the ties of blood is something which you see most apparent in that relationship. In order to conceptualize it, I had to go back to much older, to something like to Alan Bray's The Friend, which of course is about the early modern period, but which sort of kind of gave me the best account of male friendship that I could kind of think through this friendship with. And it's both personal and professional in terms of, there's lots of kind of connections. Fuseli is one of the first person to whom Johnson offers sanctuary, as he will do to Wollstonecraft, in exchange for work. So it starts as with a kind of commercial basis. Fuseli acts as a translator, an in-house translator for the firm, but it definitely kind of then widens and broadens into something much, much more significant. And that's recognized, when Johnson dies and there's a dispute over his will, one of the central tenets that his executors stick to is that the bequest of Fuseli must be kept and met, because he is one of the most important people, the most important person in Johnson's life.
And Fuseli is someone who, so one of the people on our sort of cast list who there is quite a direct connection to Blake, both in terms of Blake having engraved his designs and also them directly influencing each other. There's a Fuseli quote about stealing from Blake as being damn good to steal from, I think.
Yeah, and it's certainly the case that Fuseli allows Blake a lot more latitude than he does some of the other engravers. So he is allowed to kind of to improvise much further than our other engravers to whom Fuseli trusts his work. But there are some really interesting moments in the story. I mean, the work they do on Lavater's aphorisms on man is fascinating. The work they do on the Milton project, where Blake acts as a kind of technical advisor, and this is the abortive project where Fuseli is going to illustrate an edition of Milton produced by Cooper. And there you have Tom Paine kind of working out how to do the rolling. I mean, it's sort of extraordinary. So there are some really interesting points of connection, but Fuseli is absolutely convinced that he is the premier artist of the two. There is no question in his mind that Blake is the tradesman and he is the artist, and that's how it's going to stay. And you can, and there's that kind of subtle condescension in Blake the engraver. It's all there.
Yeah.
Johnson gets it too. I found very interesting the kind of class distinctions around trade. After he died, one of the Edgeworths said, though a bookseller, he had the soul of a gentleman. Cooper gets himself incredibly tangled up about whether Johnson is his editor and his friend or his kind of hired servant. There's a real complexities around the position of the professional craftsman and tradesman in this circle.
There's a moment where it's all in the sort of mix up with the two Milton projects, isn't it? Where William Hayley has written a letter to Cooper via Johnson, and it kind of sits at Johnson's house or office for a month. And when Cooper gets it, he's like furious that another gentleman has been kept. His letter has been kept waiting. Yeah,
no, absolutely. Something like a kind of salty horse. If he will move if you kick him. But with Cooper, there's always this kind of enormous anxiety, because although Cooper is probably one of Johnson's most important authors, the relationship is one of Johnson's most significant to Johnson's professional life. They never meet. It's conducted entirely through paper. Cooper cannot and will not leave Olney. On his journey to Sussex through London, he cowers in the carriage as it passes over Westminster Bridge. He says he said, I could see your dome in the distance, in a letter to Johnson. So it's conducted entirely on paper. So that's an interesting kind of conundrum there, that and what that does is it meant that Cooper was, although important, also partially shut out of the kind of conviviality of the dining room. And you can see that kind of anxiety about his place and his status in Johnson's world in the way in which he talks about Johnson. And so he often will send proxies or satellites to St. Paul's Churchyard to check and to chivvy. But it's about, he cannot quite kind of establish his own status in the world, which is St. Paul's Churchyard. Is he important? Are his manuscripts languishing on the floor somewhere? So distance creates real issues around how he perceives himself in this world.
I didn't know that much about Cooper. I sort of knew him most as in connection with the Hayley biography and Blake helping Hayley out with that. But I hadn't appreciated sort of how sad his story was and the extent to which he was his sort of mental ill health, how destructive that was. I mean, his
story is really sad, but it's also really astonishing. I mean, as a kind of a testimony to how the act of writing can hold the darkness at bay. I mean, that is the kind of central premise of the task, and that is what and so the fact that you have someone who can write about blackness. You know, it's just like Cooper, after his mental breakdown, which caused him to leave London and never return, spent every day of his life being completely convinced that because he tried to kill himself, that he was certain for damnation, and nothing could change that view. And so he lived with that torment daily. And at night, the terrors came. You know, that was his unshakable view that nothing he could do would prevent him from, you know, would prevent his damnation.
Mm.
And so he lived with that, but could yet write this kind of extraordinary poetry about what it is like to walk with the snow under your feet, or to watch your cucumbers growing in a greenhouse, or, you know, to sit beside a fire with a newspaper. All those images of kind of quotidian pleasure that come in the task sit against these letters in which he describes how the nightmares descend. And so Mary Unwin, who is his companion, you know, will frequently have to sit up through the night with him. So it's this kind of torment alongside this ability to make poetry out of the smallest details, you know, the bee buzzing outside the greenhouse. It's just extraordinary.
And am I right in thinking the journey where he sort of in torment crosses through London and near St Paul's is on the way to Halley's?
It's on the way to Halley's, yeah.
So there's almost a sort of you know, us Blake nuts all know the kind of Halley as employer / tormentor story when Blake goes a few years later. But there's almost a sort of earlier.
Oh yeah, I mean, Halley's a nightmare, a complete nightmare.
Yeah,
but he's not managed to get. I mean, he manages to get on a complete, you know, from a standing start. He manages to move Cooper and Mary Unwin across the country where no one else has ever managed to do it, including after Mary Unwin, who's Cooper's companion and kind of helper and friend, has had a stroke. So, you know, it's the force of his person. And then when they're there, he gets Cooper up every morning to work on Milton. And Cooper slightly kind of enjoys it, but is sort of astonished by it. But the force of Halley's personality is just sort of, it's suffocating, but Johnson resists it. But we do have these kind of terrible contests for power over something like the Cooper edition, which of course is partly about a book, but it's so much about who has the rights to Cooper's legacy, or to kind of control Cooper's legacy.
Yeah. And it's going back to Fuseli briefly. So again, we think of him as a painter and an artist and an influence on Blake, but he was, as you alluded to, a translator and a writer himself. And with Cooper, it's on the translation of Homer he did, wasn't it? He sort of, Johnson kind of set him up as Cooper's kind of editor, really.
Yeah.
Who he came to completely rely on and value.
That's absolutely right. And you Fuseli could read 5 languages, and so he was very exacting too. But you can see over the course of the work that Cooper got to the point where he could sort of preempt or anticipate Fuseli's criticisms. And so the work became kind of more organic, but eventually Fuseli had to give it up. It was just too much. I mean, the volume of work expected of him was too much. But Cooper writes about Johnson as the best editor he has, and he's sort of talking about the combination of them there.
Yeah. There's a brilliant quote I just wanted to share with people, because it made me laugh, and it also I think gives you an idea of sort of Fuseli the wit. And he wrote to a friend, I can't quite remember, was it Roscoe? I'm not sure. We said, and this is him basically giving up towards the end of the Cooper Homer translation and saying, right, I've done my bit. And he says, I heartily wish with you that Cooper had trusted to his own legs instead of a pair of stilts to lift him to fame. This I wish for my own sake, as for his, for I am deadly sick of revising his foul linen. It's lovely. Could we move on to Mary Wollstonecraft? We must talk about, who again, perhaps even more so than Fuseli. I don't want to say Johnson kind of rescued her, but he literally kind of set her up with a house and a servant and gave her like literally the means with which to start writing and to be a writer.
Yeah, they first meet just before Wollstonecraft leaves London to go and be a governess to the Kingsboroughs in Ireland, when her school at Newington Green has failed. And she takes him a manuscript of her from early work, and he likes it. So they start a correspondence. And while she's in Ireland, she writes to him and tells him how miserable she is and how much she hates it. And they sort of hatch a plan that she can come back. And as she says to her sister very famously, with his help, I will be the first of a new genus, the professional woman writer is what she means. Of course, no such thing. There are many women writers before her, but she's one of the first who seeks to make a living entirely from her pen. He doesn't have a kind of, independent income of some form. So she arrives back in London and she stays in St Paul's Churchyard for a few weeks while Johnson finds her a house. And it's a really extraordinary gesture in that he rents her a house in Southwark, and he staffs it with the servant got out of the country, and then kind of sets her to work as his kind of in-house translator and reviewer and editor. And it's a kind of composite role. He doesn't lift her out of financial insecurity, and it's really important to remember that. He's not some kind of saint. He pays her what he considers to be the going rate, either in kind or in cash. She has to work incredibly hard for it. Her life remains precarious, but it does give her a room of her own. It gives her an income. And I think there are various things that connect them. I mean, the first is clearly that he had an eye for talent. He could see her voice was original. But I think also, if you look at their letters, he knew what it was to have a large family dependent on him and to feel alone in the world despite having a large family dependent on you. He rapidly became very involved in the quite torturous work she had to do to kind of keep her estranged father and her kind of brothers who were a bit errant and her sisters all kind of together, while also protecting a space for herself. And so a friendship really seems to grow around that. And she writes about him as a kind of brother or a father figure. And he becomes tremendously important in her emotional life. There is clearly a falling out when she becomes engaged to William Godwin and is pregnant with Mary Shelley. But Johnson has been up close during the kind of misery of the post-Imlay period of Wollstonecraft life. He is a staunch defender of baby Fanny, who is the child who Wollstonecraft brings back to England when she arrives back in 1794. And Fanny's interest represented in Johnson's will very firmly. So he has kind of ties to her which are both professional and personal, which is often the pattern. So again, an enormously important relationship, and one in which we can't kind of find an obvious model for.
Yeah, again, there's like she comes across as a person as this sort of fascinating combination of things that you wouldn't think would go together. There's a sort of hard-nosed kind of realism. She's a complete idealist. She's incredibly brave, but she's like weirdly sort of emotionally naive about relationships. And in some way, just to sort of try and bring Blake in again, it reminds me a little bit of, I sometimes think of Blake as someone who, it's almost like he didn't have a protective skin, like he is just what you get, and he can't dissemble, and he can't do small talk, and he can't, and there's the Blake thing that he wrote in a letter, why was I born with a different face, which is sort of about the feelings about being like that. And Joseph Johnson says about Mary, she was incapable of disguise. Whatever was the state of her mind, it appeared when she entered, and the turn of conversation might easily be guessed. When harassed, which was often the case, she was relieved by unbosoming herself, which sounds like a similar sort of personality in some ways.
And a real desire in Wollstonecraft, or kind of a starting point in Wollstonecraft's kind of position that people were essentially good. To expect the best of people, and then to be very, very just badly but disappointed too. To find that kind of that's almost worse. In no way a cynic, although Wollstonecraft also talks about in her Thoughts on the Education of Daughters about the need to educate young women to be able to kind of stand on their own 2 feet, not to look in a cruel world for the kind of emotional and physical sustenance that that they're taught to, that they will only receive from a man. So she has a kind of realism about her too. But she, when it comes to people, I mean, she believed, Godwin writes about this in ways which I think are very gendered, that she had a kind of naive belief that it would be possible for her and Fuseli to have a kind of platonic relationship. I think there's probably more complexity to it than that, but a kind of belief that certain kinds of idealized relationships should be possible is very, very kind of central to her philosophy, I'd say.
The passages, as you say, once she's back from France with her daughter Fanny and post Imlay, where her and Godwin are getting together, are just like really moving. There's the extracts from his diary where he's talking about like them spending the night for the first time together, and does he just says chez moi when she stayed at his, and chez elle when he stayed at hers.
It's a proper grown-up romance. You know, they have both seen the world, they have both experienced heartache and loss. She is a single mum, she's trying to make a living as a writer, and the kind of the daily kind of delight and difficulty of this emerging and blossoming relationship. You know, they have to be at her house because of Fanny. Fanny gets chickenpox, and she writes, you know, that she needs a nurse herself. She's so exhausted from trying to work and stop Fanny from scratching herself. I mean, you know, a sympathy which anyone who's tried to educate a child, say at home during a pandemic, will sympathise with. You know, it's, as she writes, she says to Godwin Crossley, when you go out in the rain, you don't get your skirts, your petticoats wet to your knees with snow and rain. You come here. You know, she's kind of there's a kind of connection with the details of real, substantial, ordinary life by two people who have, you know, who are not naive, which makes it so moving. Yeah.
And again, with Wollstonecraft, there are very direct sort of work relationships with Blake, in that he illustrated the Salzman translation you mentioned, and also her original stories, which I think was before that. But also, it's very hard not to believe that some elements of her kind of life story, and also her fame for when Vindication of the Rights of Women came out, makes its way into, like, particularly Visions of the Daughters of Albion, sort of thing.
And I think, I mean, Blake obviously, you know, talks about kind of Johnson holding him back, but actually, you know, you can see, I mean, I'm not a Blake scholar, so I now feel on slightly dodgy ground, but you can see the register of the work that Johnson publishes, and so much of what Blake, you know, Bonnycastle's descriptions of scales and instruments, you know, you can see in the early in his early the early work for Bonnycastle, you can see its echoes in Newton. You know, there are so many, you know, Wollstonecraft, and you know, the language of the work of Alexander Gibbs is another of Johnson's you know, authors. You know, Blake is also absorbing an enormous amount through the work he does and the conversations he hears at St Paul's Churchyard.
There's the narrative by I forget the full name of the Gabriel Stedman.
Absolutely, the 5 years expedition.
Like both the illustrations that Blake does for that, and also the content and the descriptions of enslavement, obviously make their way, like, again, specifically into Visions of the Daughters of Albion, but generally into his sort of prophetic works. You can see all of that. I fear we're running out of time, and I must allow other people to ask questions soon. But could we talk about Joseph Priestley for a few minutes? So yeah, as you said in your introduction, he's sort of like Enlightenment man. He's sort of writing off and thinking in all sorts of directions about science and religion and politics, and but like a very important character for Johnson, and also like indicative of that, as you said, that sort of Unitarian influence is very important to him and his whole kind of publishing house.
Enormously important, and partly because Priestley is such a polymath. He joins Johnson's as a writer of educational work, his essay on thoughts of education, on a course of education, but it then extends to be so much more. So both in terms of Unitarianism, you know, that's the religion, of course, Erasmus Darwin called a featherbed to catch a falling Christian, and where Priestley himself was described as the Voltaire of the Unitarians. Unitarianism absolutely at the centre of the story, because it offers a way for religious men to push at the boundaries of the known universe. You know, in Priestley's version of Unitarianism, to inquire is to fulfil one's spiritual mission in life. Priestley describes how, and it's, again, you can see this in Blake, how the veins and sinews of a human hand are as beautiful as any vision of heaven. So there's kind of, you know, that's very, very important. He shows Johnson a model of being a polymath, where, you know, how you educate your children is about how you look after the future of your country. You know, the stakes are enormously high. But also then, of course, in 1791, Priestley becomes the great Unitarian martyr, because he and his wife were firebombed out of their house during the Birmingham riots, in scenes which, when you read the first-hand descriptions of what happened, are truly horrific. and they arrive as kind of exiles, in St Paul's Church, as refugees, the absolute exemplars of the spirit of repression, which is kind of coursing through the land. And Blake is among those who watches them leave, who watches them, sail for America. So their story is a kind of physical instantiation of repression too. And Johnson publishes some incredibly vivid, visual, kind of iconographic responses to the Birmingham riots. He publishes a small book which is simply images of the bombed out houses of Birmingham to kind of show, the dissenting ruin writ large, the kind of what happens when the mob takes over. So Priestley comes to stand for an enormous amount too.
Yeah, there are two I think really moving parts of the book, and one of them is the death of Mary Wollstonecraft, and then the other is the Birmingham riots. And I hadn't realised the extent of the damage and the extent to which lives were just completely ruined and
those stories float around that circle. 27 private houses are destroyed that night. They all know the families who have suffered. So the most vivid account is actually partly by Priestley, partly by a young woman who writes as an old woman called Martha Russell, whose father William is one of the kind of Birmingham merchants. And she writes about fleeing when it was clear their house was going to fall, in a group of women, all carrying children wrapped in blankets in the middle of the night, and then carrying in a hedgerow while men on horseback charge by, calling for her father's head. I mean, it's just terrifying to read. And these stories are all circulating around St Paul's Churchyard. Priestley arrives in London and scuttles back and forth between Johnson's house and the house of Theophilus Lindsay, who we haven't talked about, but he's another hugely important figure, and his chapel on Essex Street, and watching over his shoulder as he goes. So no one needs to imagine repression or exile in 1791 if you're in this circle. It's right there in front of you.
Yeah. The other thing about Priestley I thought was interesting, and the Unitarian aspects of things, is so we think of Blake as being kind of part of this group, although, as you've said, in certain ways not quite. But of course what Priestley wants, and there's a one of his many publications, Institutes of Natural and Revealed Religion, I think particularly dwelt on this. And then I think it's a quote from a different book, but he talks about rational Christians. It's the idea of having Christianity as a rational religion that's based on observation. And of course that would have been anathema to Blake. And so we think of Blake as sort of rebelling against the kind of authoritarian rule of Pitt's government, for example, and obviously in many ways he was part of the same sort of I suppose what we would now say is progressive kind of political project of this group. But I suppose in some ways that's what he's rebelling against as well. That's the deism that he's writing against and that disturbs him is Priestley and Johnson as well.
And there are real factions emerge in the group. That the Hazlitt's generation cannot get behind. Hazlitt's father, of course, the Unitarian minister, but Hazlitt Jr. Is a follower of Godwin, not of Johnson and Priestley. But the other phrase which reverberates right through this is a phrase which comes up in just a little pamphlet Johnson publishes in the wake of the Gordon riots, where the writer talks about sinless anger, and that idea of sinless anger as a kind of touchstone for how to live when you are assailed by kind of political forces is, I think, really important too.
The other person we haven't talked about, well, one of the many people we haven't talked about is Thomas Paine. But I really, just before, I think we must get on to our dessert and go to questions from everyone who wants to ask you things. But we must very quickly talk, and maybe Thomas Paine will get covered in this a little bit, about Joseph Johnson going to court, his trial and imprisonment. Spoilers, everyone, sorry, but which happens a little bit later. Could you give us the outline of that?
Sure. He's put on trial for publishing Wakefield's address to the Bishop of, sorry, I'm having a mental blank. Reply to the Bishop of Llandaff, isn't it? And he's not the printer of it, but it's found in his shop, and what's clearly a sting operation. A government spy goes and buys all the copies in his shop. And he's sentenced to 6 months in the King's Bench prison, where he sort of relocates his operations for a bit. But it causes, although he's able to kind of keep going, it causes a real shift in the kind of MO of St Paul's Churchyard. He has to close the analytical review. His freedom is contingent on what he publishes. It's a point where he begins to turn to the future and think about, what will come after him. It sends real shivers again through the kind of dissenting merchant radical community. Although Johnson's not himself kind of, squarely a radical. That, if they can come for Johnson, is what the kind of letters that you can read in Dr. Williams' library. So, then who next?
Yeah, there's the aspect of it I love is that they carry on having dinners. Like he prisons in the 18th century. If you got the money, you can sort of make prison bearable, right? So they set him up in the is it the warden's?
It's the coachman's house, and there's an amazing bit he describes his admissions to the prison and his supporters, who are clearly Roland Hunter and Fuseli, kind of negotiating for all the things he's going to need from the prison governor. And Johnson's standing there thinking, but I have to pay.
Yeah, he says something like, "I think I would be more of a miser." But yeah. But I love the fact that they just carry on. They just come south of the river for the weekly dinners instead, and they still come and see him, and he carries on working. Again, just the two thoughts I had that relate that maybe to Blake a little bit again is that the pamphlet that is it Gilbert Wakefield wrote, which is the one that they get him with, as it were, is it's sort of full of his. So this is this 1790?
1798.
Yeah. So there's this big sort of invasion scare from the French, and some of the stuff that he writes in this pamphlet is more or less saying, well, look, if they come, I'm not going to fight, and it struck me as that, reading between the lines of what William and Catherine may have said to the Skullfield soldier in their garden 5 years later, it might have been that sort of thing that might have been said in haste, And the other thing, I suppose, is very much in the line of what you were just saying, that for Blake 5 years later, finding himself on trial for sedition, well, there's an example of like how that could go badly wrong, and he must have been thinking about like, well, I could end up in prison in the same way, or worse, not having the money to make it so nice for himself, perhaps. I think we must. There's loads more I want to ask you, but I feel like we must move on to our dessert and let everyone ask any questions that they would like to. So I think what we need to do, so people can, I should have checked, is it in reactions? I can never remember where if you can put up your sort of digital hand to wave, and then we can see you. Or is it in, I can't remember where you do it, but
it's in reactions.
Yeah. So if anyone's got any questions, I don't know whether do I need to change my view? Yeah, there we go. And I'll try and spot you. And then I think we can highlight you, and you'll just need to unmute yourself. And please feel free to turn your cameras on as well, so we can see you all. I feel like I can hear noises from Kerry.
Oh, sorry. I just turned my audio on. I wasn't. Oh, well, if you want a question, it's. I wonder if you could say something about the French Revolution. I mean, Blake's poem, The French Revolution. It was always puzzled me, A, why Johnson chose to publish it, and B, why he decided not to publish it. Can you clarify that in any way?
I mean, probably no more than quite a lot of people in this call have already kind of given quite a lot of thought to this. I mean, it's clear that circumstances change in France between the writing of the first part and what subsequently comes. It's not the only work where Johnson changes direction on. I mean, it's clear that one of the reasons, or not the only one, but one of the reasons for the abandonment of the Milton project is that kind of work celebrating regicide becomes just too hot by 1794. So there is clearly a kind of sense of a change in political climate, but it's very unclear. I mean, I have found no records to clarify what happens in that, what happens in that interregnum between the two parts. Whether Johnson didn't quite know what he was getting when he signed up for the French Revolution. I mean, he is often someone who is quite kind of quick to make decisions. There's certain kind of carelessness. Sometimes work, the problem with Gabriel Steadman is that he hands it over to be edited by a hack writer who then kind of does things that Steadman finds appalling. So the decisions are often probably quick rather than agony. He's not looking at Blake and thinking, this exceptionally important person has brought me a manuscript that I must publish at all costs. He's probably reading it quite quickly and thinking, it's another, I don't know, this is speculation. But I would say, in terms of deciding not to publish, my strong sense is that would be contextual. That Johnson never makes a decision which compromises his kind of ability to hold house together. He withdraws from publishing The Rights of Man. Too many people depend on the light staying on. And he is quite hard-headed about that. So I think that's where I would put that probably, that it's around a kind of pragmatism in response to a shifting political context where even the most ardent supporters of the French Revolution are beginning to think again by 1793.
Okay, yeah. Is it perhaps that it's only when he sees it in print that he knows what he's dealing with?
Yeah, and I think that feels very plausible too. That you take a look at a manuscript and you see one thing, but then you set it in type and you see another. And of course, it is fragmentary too. So I would guess that it's also just in Johnson's world, it isn't finished.
Mm. I think the comparison with not quite publishing Tom Paine twice is quite interesting. And Tom Paine was obviously much more of a hot potato than Blake was, much more infamous and famous. But there's I just remembered this quote I really wanted to share with everyone. When Johnson was offered the chance to publish the second part of Rights of Man, he asked John Bonnycastle, being a sort of, I think, a political moderate, to have a look at it and showed him the manuscript. And Bonnycastle said to him, if you wish to be hanged or immured in prison all your life, publish this book, which was very direct.
Yeah, I mean, when Johnson hears that in 1798 that there's trouble around Wakefield, he has all the copies taken out the shop. It's too late. The spy has already made his purchases. But he isn't someone he's not a provocateur in terms of the law in the 1790s. And when people push him about this or accuse him of being timorous, he will push back on the grounds of kind of pragmatism. There's some suggestion around Paine that he was visited by government agents and told not to publish. Theophilus Lindsay posits this in a letter that Johnson has grown cautious because of a visit from the state, which is entirely plausible given what we know about the kind of network of surveillance and interference in kind of private and commercial life in the early 1790s. But there's a wealth of evidence of Johnson acting quite cautiously in the face of a very mobile and shifting legal landscape.
Do we have any other questions for Daisy? Oh, we have a question from Jennifer.
Yes, thank you so much, Daisy, for this marvelous presentation. I have not had the opportunity to read your book yet. I'm kind of just wondering, I mean, I can hardly imagine how many records, letters, journals, legal documents, and others that you had to research to create this exquisitely detailed account of that dinner gathering. Can you talk just a little bit, just give us a sense of the range of kinds of sources that you used here, and maybe what were some of the most unusual?
Well, that's such an interesting question. Well, yes, thank you very much. Yes, there's loads of it. There's too much information, too much material. At one point, I sat down and counted and made a chart. Like Priestley, he used to produce these enormous charts of biography. So I made a chart, and there were 63 people in the book, which is clearly too many. So material all over the UK primarily. So the Edgeworth papers in Ireland, and lots of things in the Bodleian. Obviously, I try to look at every primary source for the people in the book, either printed or where there was an archival collection. I don't know. There's an extraordinary letter from from William Enfield to John Murray, written in the early 1770s, late 1760s. I think late 1760s. So John Murray I and Johnson were big friends. John Murray I arrives in London from Edinburgh and sets up his own book-selling business, and they become great friends and competitors. And we have Johnson, you know, with this Unitarian figure, and Enfield writes to Murray. Is that right, the way around? Yes. No, Murray writes to Enfield and says, "Our friend Joseph Johnson is well. We are making wonderful books this winter. I know he's well in spite of. I know nothing of his itch or the bountiful lady who gave it him." And so there was this kind of extraordinary moment where, you know, a curtain lifts into another kind of world. And the cheerfulness and everydayness of this moment is something I find really striking, actually. I also found the rules governing the behaviour of apprentices, which are in the Guildhall and library, very fascinating, because there's just something extraordinary about the idea of a 14-year-old being given a piece of paper, you know, signing up to a system which prevents whoring and gaming and playing of dice in the street, and of card playing in the city of the 1760s in Hogarth. You know, in Hogarth City, I found the kind, these are exactly contemporaneous, and I found that idea of this Baptist boy signed up to these indentures in this kind of lawless, anarchic cityscape to be very fascinating.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Do we have any other questions? While people are mulling over all of this information, oh no, we got one from Jason Whitaker. There he is.
He's also just looking for the unmute button. That was incredible. I absolutely love that. Thank you very much. It's actually following on in parts from that question of using your sources. You give that wonderful little insight into the kind of quotidian insights into Johnson's life. I was just wondering, in relation to the Blakean sources, to drill down a little bit, which were the ones that you were using in particular? Sorry, this is very, you know, because I've been doing sort of stuff on Blake's life, etc. Johnson appeals quite a bit, but I was relying very much on the secondary sources there. So I was just wondering who were the primary ones that you were using in relation to Blake in particular. I'm sorry for such a dry question.
No, I will answer it.
Evening.
I hope my answer won't horrify you. Primarily in William Gilchrist and some of the anecdotes in Blake records, but with a hefty pinch of salt.
Okay.
You know, these kind of famous anecdotes that Blake kind of comes running into the dining room at number 72 and tells Payne that he must flee for his life. Is, you know, I wasn't repeating that verbatim, but I was trying to get a sense of kind of where Blake's 19th century biographers, those who might have known Johnson or Roland Hunter, place him in that, you know, in that circle. So those were the, and Gilchrist gives a well substantiated account of the dining room too. So those were my primary sources, and you know, where possible, Blake's voice himself actually. And again, just trying to map on, you know, well, if Johnson is a figure of London, then what do we know what Blake thinks about London? So trying to just be a little bit lateral in how I kind of put this together. But I also found Farrington's Diary very fascinating, because again, it's a kind of completely, you know, it takes away all we think we know about what's important. You know, and it shows us, you know, a world where everything we know is in the process of being formed. So Blake is just an engraver. There's some interesting gossip about Mrs. Wollstonecraft, where his name was spelt as people who heard her name but never saw it written down, you know, spelt it from the tales about her. So in terms of kind of placing Blake in the hierarchy of the circle, I found Farrington a really, really useful source.
Thank you. That's great. I also don't feel so bad now about relying on Blake records and Gilchrist myself. So fantastic. Thank you.
Any other questions? Tim has a question.
I just wondered if, because both Johnson and Blake were apprenticed, they went through the long apprenticeship. Does this make any special bond between them, or was that just a very common feature of the period?
I'm not sure about the apprenticeship specifically, but I think there's a strong connection around being a tradesman, around having a skill and a craft and being engaged in the world of making, which is, which is there's a kind of parity. I think it's not a favour that Johnson allows Blake to display the illuminated books in the window at St Paul's Churchyard. It's about, there's a kind of professional respect there, which is not the same as saying Johnson has a kind of appreciation of Blake's vision, but a kind of sense of being men engaged in the world of London bookmaking, which is both very competitive, as the city of assassins, Blake's quotation, but also kind of highly collaborative and collegial. This is the world in which the legal records that matter are not those at the stationer's company, but those kept behind the counter at the chapter coffee house. So this kind of highly personable world of city bookmakers and printmakers seems to be a place where they're kind of, which forges a connection between them. And Johnson commissions far more engravings from Blake than anybody else does. So he is Blake's most significant and important employer over right through the 1780s. So he prioritizes Blake. Blake is not just a jobbing engraver in this world. There are other kind of celebrity engravers too, but Blake is absolutely kind of at the heart of this group of skilled subcontractors. And of course, to make a book in the 1780s includes working with an enormous range of professionals. You're working with printers and paper makers and binders and tanners and engravers and the list and block makers. The list goes on and on and on. And so that's where I see the connections, rather than in the kind of shared experience of apprenticeship, which I guess because it feels more common, but it's not something I thought about. It certainly is an experience that they have, which others around the table don't have.
Thank you.
Daisy, could you tell us a bit more about the Analytical Review, which seems like it was an extraordinary publication?
So it's founded in 1788 by Johnson and edited by him, owned by him, and edited by Thomas Christie, who's a kind of young Scot who arrives in London looking to make a name for himself, and is well connected. And its aim is to survey all the most important thinking on any subject coming out of both the London printing presses, but right across Europe. So it kind of aggregate, both reviews work published from lots of different types of work published in Britain, but it reviews the kind of proceedings of the learned societies and Paris and Orleans and Vienna, and a kind of survey of the most important fresh thinking right across Europe. I don't want to be too sentimental, but it has a kind of vision of knowledge which is unboundaried by national borders, and it becomes tremendously influential in partly because of the kind of the people who Johnson brings to it. I mean, although people review anonymously, the quality where you have Fuseli and Wollstonecraft and Alexander Gies, all these people writing for it, produces a kind of real quality in terms of the engagement with the text. So sometimes it's something that it covers lots of Unitarian publications. It covers the Regency crisis in tremendous detail in 1788, but it also just kind of surveys the broad landscape of publishing. So it gives a kind of an enormously kind of wide ranging sense of what's being published. It comes out in an era, of course, when quick responses are possible in print. Because of cheap labour and improvements in technology, there can be a scandal on a Tuesday, a pamphlet can be written on the weekend and put into press, and then it can be responded to within 10 days. And the Analytical is quite quick to pick up on the kind of the advantages of that kind of quick form publication. But one of the things it does is it just takes the conversations happening over dinner at St Paul's Churchyard and it kind of disseminates them out into the country. It's the place where all those ideas kind of echo out in print. And one of the models that Johnson sees when he's an apprentice for George Keith is that a Baptist preacher so Keith is married to the daughter of John Fell, and they publish lots of his sermons. The print pulpit can offer those who are otherwise disenfranchised an enormous reach. So, the sermons of Theophilus Lindsay, Johnson's great friend, may only reach a few hundred people, if that, in Essex Street Chapel every Sunday. But because they're put into print, Johnson can get them out incredibly fast. And so the analytical repeats that, the idea that if you can disseminate in print ideas about the value of education, about the need of abolition, about the need for kind of bold international conversations about developments in chemistry and natural philosophy, then that will have a kind of enlightening effect. That's the mission behind it.
It does seem to be sort of his whole philosophy made into a thing, like into
I think
a
that's absolutely
thing.
right. That's a really nice
Yeah.
way of putting it. Yeah.
The analytical review, as you've already said, was one of the things that effectively got sort of shut down by his prosecution and ceased publication after that. But towards the end of the book, you suggest that Leigh Hunt and his publication, The Examiner, was kind of based on the blueprint of the analytical review, and that he sort of took forward some of the ideas and things that Johnson was doing as a publisher who kind of championed the next generation of writers, and indeed I think went to prison for libel himself. Funny thing, of course, from a Blake nerd perspective, is that Leigh Hunt's Examiner is where Blake's 1809 exhibition, and I think The Grave as well, got a pasting by Leigh Hunt's brother Robert. So it's tempting to sort of think of them as the baddies in the kind of Blake saga, and indeed they get turned into Hand in Jerusalem, the sort of one of the kind of villains. So it's really interesting again to sort of think of Blake as being part of this world and sort of, you know, on the same.
Leigh Hunt is the hero of my first book.
Okay.
Because he's a great friend of Shelley's, so he's a central figure of my first book, Young Romantics. The reason he's there is because in 1809, the last year of Johnson's life, Leigh Hunt marries Roland Hunter's stepdaughter. So Roland Hunter marries, his wife has two daughters, she's widowed with two daughters, and one of those daughters, Marianne, it becomes Leigh Hunt's wife. So Roland Hunter is his father-in-law. So he comes to dinner in the last year of Johnson's life as kind of Hunter's proxy son-in-law. So what he sees then, and he's the one who writes up Bonnycastle goggling over his plate like a horse.
Right. Yeah.
So what he sees is this kind of model of collegiality and of sociability, which is the term associated with Hunt more particularly, which you really see kind of playing out in the way in which he creates a kind of community in his cottage in Hampstead after his release, and in his own prison cell, because he goes to prison too, with Shelley and Keats and Marianne Hunt and her sister Elizabeth Kent. So yeah, for me, there are very direct correlations. That Hunt, rather than Roland Hunter, is really the true inheritor of Johnson's ideas. But of course, what he inherits famously is none of Johnson's financial or business acumen.
I think we've more or less run out of time. I urge you all to read Dinner with Joseph Johnson. I think it's terrific. And now, of course, we know we must read Daisy's first book as well to follow the Leigh Hunt story. Tim, would you like to give us to send us off into the night with our final address?
Yes, I'd like to thank John and Daisy for a very wonderful evening. And I commend all of you to look at Daisy's book as an object. Blake, as the patron of makers, I'm sure would have been delighted with this object that has been created to contain the words of Daisy Hay. So please go out and touch the book and hold it in your hands and buy it. So with that, thank you both, Daisy and John, for a very wonderful evening.
Thank you. It's been a huge pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Daisy. Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.